How dangerous is North Korea? And what can the world do about it? A fifth nuclear test on Friday was Pyongyang's biggest yet, and possibly a sign of significant technological advances. It drew universal international condemnation, including from the country's biggest ally, China. The UN has threatened more sanctions, but do these have any impact on a defiant regime that's intent on developing its nuclear weapons capability? Yvette McCullough takes a look.
North Korea boasting about increasing its nuclear capabilities. On Friday, it said it had successfully conducted an underground nuclear test explosion, triggering a magnitude 5.3 earthquake. It's North Korea's fifth such test and its strongest ever. North Korea says it is now capable of mounting nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles. The international reaction has been condemnation.
Now our and the international community's patience is going beyond limit.
We need to, and we will, strongly protest against their actions.
We strongly urge North Korea to keep its commitment of non-proliferation.
He stands alone, and he invites even greater isolation.
This is North Korea's second nuclear test this year. In January, it said it detonated a hydrogen bomb, prompting UN sanctions. Sanctions, it would seem, that have done nothing to deter it from its nuclear ambitions. The Hermit Kingdom, secretive, isolated, defensive, but also a country trying to change its image. Pyongyang is starting to open up to tourists and to international media. AFP is the latest news agency to open a bureau in the capital. But North Korea's economy is struggling and its people need outside help. Despite this, Pyongyang has continued its provocative posturing by testing ballistic missiles and threatening nuclear attacks on its so-called enemies. Even condemnation from China, North Korea's economic lifeline and only major ally, isn't having an impact. What is North Korea's strategy and goal? Can it attract tourists and foreign funds while being more provocative and threatening than ever? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Oliver Hotham, who's managing editor of NK News, an independent website that focuses on North Korea. Thanks a lot for joining us, Oliver. Tell me a little bit about this paradox. On the one hand, North Korea is opening up once tourism. I managed to go there, ran in the Pyongyang Marathon, filmed without too much trouble. On the other hand, you have these threats and you have them conducting more nuclear tests. Demystify the paradox for us.
Well, it doesn't seem to have there doesn't seem to be a massive connection between the two things. North Korea, over the last 3 years, has continued its nuclear tests, has boasted about its increased capabilities, and through missile tests and through sort of big provocations, as you've described. But yet at the same time, tourism and, as you said, things like the Pyongyang Marathon, the opening up of the markets there, seem to be increasing. So there doesn't seem to be a massive connection between those two things. Whether or not now we might see a sort of that this test might be the last straw could be possible, but there isn't necessarily a precedent there.
Mm-hmm. So South Korea says the North is ready to carry out another nuclear test anytime soon. Do you believe that at this moment in time, North Korea poses a genuine, tangible nuclear threat to South Korea or the US or whoever?
Well, it's difficult to say. At the moment, they haven't been able to prove that they would be able to put the warhead onto the ballistic missile that would be able to, say, hit the mainland United States. But it certainly seems as though they're getting pretty close. And the analysts that we've spoken to have said that it could be something that might be able to happen within the next 2 or 3 years. And once that happens, once they can prove that capability, then certainly this regime that has such bellicose rhetoric and such seeming disregard for what the international community says of it, and no matter what sanctions seem to be enforced, it doesn't seem to make much difference. So I think once that happens, then we could say that North Korea would be a tangible nuclear threat. But until then, it's sort of about assessing their capabilities and about trying to work out what it is that can be done to stop them, essentially.
Are the Chinese facing a mega conundrum here? Because on the one hand, they don't want a collapsed economy and a flood of refugees across their border. They want their neighbor to be somewhat stable, even though it might be totalitarian. And on the other hand, they want to rein in this rogue regime that uses any financial aid that it gets to beef up its nuclear arsenal and continues to threaten South Korea and the United States and others.
It does, and one point you didn't mention was the fact that there's a great deal of trade between North Korea and China, which is one of the reasons that many have argued that the sanctions haven't been adequately enforced by China, simply because it's not necessarily in their economic interest. But at the same time, China has to is on this UN Security Council. It has to make a big show about being opposed to the nuclear test and being opposed to instability more broadly on the Korean Peninsula. So they face this dichotomy, but at the same time, there's not really much they can do. North Korea's foreign minister went to China just a few days ago after the test, and it doesn't seem to have resulted in any kind of ramping down of North Korea's post-test bellicose sort of rhetoric in any way. So and in many ways the test might be a means for North Korea and for Pyongyang to assert its independence from China in lots of ways and say, well, we are going to pursue this nuclear path regardless of what China says, and knowing full well that there isn't really much that China can do about it in many ways. But again, we'll have to see what happens in the next few days and weeks, and when the Security Council comes up with something more binding from what they've already done, which is sort of simply general condemnation.
Yeah, one of the levers some individual countries are trying to use is to apply pressure by refusing to let North Korean guest workers work in their countries. I mean, the North Koreans send workers overseas to China, Russia, Qatar, Libya, Senegal, and so on, and they do multiple things, including making those wonderful bronze statues. Could that be a lever that might actually work, that it might put pressure on the North Koreans to say, hey, we need to do something different now because this was bringing in a lot of cash and it might not bring in that much cash anymore?
Well, in theory, it would. And I mean, a great deal of hard currency comes to the regime from the exporting of labor. But it's about whether or not, as I said before, whether or not these countries will be able to get on board. I mean, you mentioned Russia, for example, and Russia has actually, in the last few years, as North Korea has ramped up its nuclear test, increased its economic relationships with the DPRK. And I mean, you mentioned Qatar as well. It's whether or not they would be in a position to take that risk, and obviously it's a double-sided relationship. I mean, Russia enjoys cheap North Korean exported labor, and North Korea enjoys the hard currency. So it really depends on the international geopolitics of this and whether or not these countries can be convinced to come on side and enforce these types of sanctions, which I'm not necessarily convinced will happen. Mm-hmm. I think if there was ever going to be a major sea change in this, it would have happened previously in the year on the first test of the year, which was the first in 3 years. And since that didn't happen then, I'm not necessarily convinced it'll happen now.
Oliver Hotham, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us. In today's Picture This, in the searing Saudi heat, Muslim pilgrims have completed the most important ritual of the Hajj, making their way to Mount Arafat. Let's take a look. Our newsmaker today was Zimbabwe's President Robert Mugabe. The former independence hero has been in charge since 1980, but his hold on power is looking shakier than ever. A crippling economic crisis is pushing many Zimbabweans to the streets in anger, and even long-standing supporters are now starting to question the 92-year-old's leadership. One of our guests was Bright Matonga, the former Deputy Information Minister, and for many years the government's effective spokesman in the international media. He told us the country now needs new ideas and fresh blood. And he said that Mugabe is presiding over a system that's oppressing people. But whether it's political maneuvering or age that finally brings an end to the Mugabe era, there remains big questions over whether a peaceful transfer of power can take place and what post-Mugabe Zimbabwe will look like. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.